Hello and welcome to the Social World Podcast. I'm Dave Niven and it's good to be back again. This podcast is a bit of a mixture, a magazine. At the beginning I'm going to play you an interview I did with the BBC in Wales to do with a report from Europe concerning missing children. Now, the premise of that particular study was that after children have been publicised very widely, the details of photographs and descriptions and so forth during a search for them when they've gone missing, if they do indeed turn up successfully afterwards and go on to carry on with their childhood and their lives, the report suggests that we ought to be pressurising the platforms, the Googles of this world, the Facebooks, the Instagrams, so forth, that need to remove these children's details because it embarrasses them at the very least later on in life. It points fingers at them, and in some cases they've found to have been severely bullied because of the identification of them in the media. I felt personally it was an enormously difficult thing to do, apart from to try and interrupt, after all, what is people's desperation to find their child. And eventually it will be spread all over social media, and there's just no way sometimes of putting the genie back in the bottle. So that was an interesting point there, an interesting interview, and I'd be very interested to hear what you all think out there about it, because it's one of these things for me that's kind of 50-50. You can't deny people the opportunity to do anything to find a child. And at the same time, we all know that we don't like children identified if they've been through a traumatic situation, whether that's they've been abused or whether in this case they've been missing or whatever. It's something that you don't want children to have to live with because it's unfair on them and they haven't made the decisions for themselves. The main interview of this podcast is with Dave Benn. Now, this is one in the series of the Bradford interviews, Bradford Safeguarding Board, and Dave is the voluntary sector representative on the board, and so it's pretty good to get his views on their position, where he stands, what he feels, and it's good also to have some input from time to time on a non-statutory basis. So there we are. Apart from the extremely sad story that I read in the newspaper the other day, poignant, a metaphor for our times, if you like, and without going into too much detail, you can think about it for yourselves. It was that this young couple had a child, had a baby who died, and they went and they buried it themselves because they didn't think that they could afford a proper funeral. And I just felt hugely sad for that couple, obviously for the baby, but a sign of the times, austerity, or just punishing the poor again. It makes you wonder. Anyway, without further ado, let's get on with the podcast, and thanks for listening.
Well, let's speak to David Niven, who's a child protection expert. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
Has much research been done in this area then, in terms of the impact that publicity might have on a missing child after the event?
Not in this country that I'm aware of. There are places, centres for study of missing children and events like that at the universities and so forth, but I don't think there's any comprehensive work been done. I mean, there's always the overriding kind of thing that are sent out that we don't want to identify children if they've been in part of a traumatic event or they're actually being in the news for the wrong reasons. That's a kind of a given, and the media does respect that. But social media, to be quite frank, has a mind of its own sometimes. And you can totally understand the desperation sometimes of families. If a child's missing, they'll just use social media now because it's a platform available to everybody, and they'll just blast out all the details they possibly can in their desperation to find the child.
Yeah, and I suppose in those first few frantic hours of someone going missing, social media can be a positive thing because you can get the message out there much more quickly. These things often get hundreds of thousands in some cases of shares, and you want to, that as an instinct as a parent, I suppose that's exactly what you want at that moment in time.
Well, that's it, and that's our dilemma, because on one hand, you can totally understand that. You would probably, everybody listening would probably do it for their own child. But at the same time, you don't actually then sit down and think, well, what about once we find the child, what impact is this going to have on them? I don't think that really crosses people's minds in that sort of desperate few sort of days or weeks or ever, at the beginning of somebody being missing.
Yeah, and it's something other countries are looking at, isn't it? Because in Belgium, they've got a missing child hotline, Child Focus, and that children can contact that helpline and basically get, I think, a lot of things kind of erased on the internet. That right to be forgotten then.
Now I like the idea of that, and I like the idea of some sort of central place that people can go to, that the authorities have got some degree of control over, that advice can be given. And if you like, it can be as discreet as possible. The only difficulty, of course, is that once these days we know that something is out on social media, it's like trying to catch the wind in terms of putting it back, or in terms of taking information back again. So education, absolutely, in terms of what impact these things could have later on. Support from the authorities by way of some kind of discrete focus or discrete place that parents or families or others can go to and have a lot of support at the same time as getting best advice about what the future might hold when the child's found. But more than that, social media platforms, I think, have got a role to play here too in making it easier to remove information if the proper requests come through from the proper authorities and people who know what they're talking about. It's a very, very difficult subject. It's a conundrum. Nobody wants anything prevented that would help find a missing child. At the same time, is the same as a child who's been abused and hits the headlines or whatever. You want them to be anonymised for the rest of their life because that's not something they want to live with.
Thank you very much for speaking to us this morning, child protection expert David Niven there.
Okay, well, welcome to the Social World podcast, and today we're venturing into the voluntary sector. I'm delighted to be joined by Dave Benn, who is on the Bradford Safeguarding Children Board as a full member, and a very prominent representation of the voluntary and community sector, and he chairs the service subgroup for the voluntary and community sector as well. What a mouthful. Okay, well, welcome, Dave.
Thank you, David, and thank you for inviting me to this podcast.
Okay, well, you're also a service manager for Barnardo's. So essentially you've got quite a bit of experience tucked under your belt. So, look, tell us just a little bit, would you, about your own pathway here, how you actually, what your career's been so far, just to give people a context.
Okay, so my background is reasonably varied, actually, and in terms of coming to Bradford, it was really directed by education and further education, but prior to that I worked in a number of settings, mainly within youth work, and I've got experience of working in outdoor education in Scotland and in the Lake District. That led me on to a sort of a path of thinking I need to get qualified, and it would be helpful to get qualified within a youth work environment. I went to college in Bradford, and and I've remained here ever since, to be honest. I've worked across the districts, but it was youth work that first brought me here. Since joining Barnardo as an organisation, I've since become qualified as a social worker because of the nature of the work that we were undertaking and the management role that I've since adopted in terms of that. I've been in Bradford now managing a cluster of services for over 10 years. And I've been actually involved in the board in terms of what was the old ACPC, and it's moved towards a local Safeguarding Children Board. I was actually part of that transition arrangement, so I've been with the board, and it feels a long time now, so it's over 10 years in terms of my role. And so it's combined the role as a service manager. I feel I've got a reasonable and a very hands-on approach to my understanding of the key issues in relation to working with young people in the district. I'm very proud of the services that we deliver, and I'm very proud of the sector as a whole in relation to the role we play and the nature of the work we deliver.
Okay, well, I'm not going to make the joke about what you do in the afternoons, but essentially the voluntary sector, I mean, it is one of the pillars of support networks, within any community. And its ability to form partnerships and be part of a collective, I think, is pretty crucial. No matter where we go, where we see good work, we do see it done in partnership. I mean, do you want to just talk a little bit about what your experience has been of that over the years in the Bradford area?
Yeah, I mean, Bradford's got a long and rich history in relation to its VCS and commitment to social inclusion and the provision of services. We've got a large and significant number of organisations which play a vital role, as you say, in terms of representation on the board and my role in relation to that. I actually, whilst I work for Barnardo's, I'm clearly a representative of Young Lives Bradford, which is an infrastructure organisation in the local district, which has got over 300 organisations which are registered with it. All youth work or all youth-related organisations and childcare.
That's Young Lives Bradford.
Yeah, it's Young Lives Bradford.
Yeah.
And so that acts in terms of infrastructure, it's support, coordinating and partnership arrangements in relation to pooling information, but also giving voice and representation to that group of organisations. And within that, there are large national organisations, Barnardo's, Action for Children, others. There's smaller regional organisations. And significantly, there are very small organisations which are represented in at a district level, but also potentially at a sort of regional, at a district level, a community-based level. Okay, so that might be large numbers of staff, or it might be a two-man band that are delivering services.
So that's the incredibly diverse structure in terms of the voluntary and the community sector, which we know exists. But Young Lives Bradford is obviously quite a cohesive kind of group in terms of actually sort of peer support and so on. But we've heard about the systems. Why don't you tell us just one or two examples of success stories that you feel that structure, that partnership has delivered?
Yeah, so I think you're right in terms of partnership and peer support. I think the VCS is unique in some ways in relation to our partnership on the board, in that it's made up a number of organisations which are, have their own identity, their own infrastructure and governance arrangements, but we come together in terms of pooling those resources, but also offering support to each other. I think in terms of success in relation to that, I think we've got representation on the board, and I think that's a big success, and I think it's to the credit of the board and the partnership arrangements locally that that's the case. I think there's a coherence in relation to the way that we manage information going up and down into the sector in terms of, I obviously represent the board at main board meetings, but there are other activities going on elsewhere which I think are very successful. We've got representation on each of the subgroups, well, the majority of the subgroups, not all, but the majority of the subgroups within the board. And that's a lot of work gets done within those subgroups.
Do you just say a little bit about what they are? Because obviously there's a lot of listeners who aren't totally intimate with the exact structures.
Yeah, so in terms of the structure of the board, in terms of the subgroups, so there's a number of different subgroups which will take on either standing business of the board or will remain as task finish. And I'll give you one example, the CSE task group.
That's child sexual exploitation.
Which is a relatively new group, I think, and we've now got representation on that, which in some ways represents some of the work that's been going on in Bradford in terms of how we're supporting the hub, the preventative work in relation to CSE. Recently there's a report has been issued by a range of organisations, including Barnardo's, but including Children's Society, Build, etc., called Protected, Underprotected, Overprotected, in terms of CSE and young people with learning disabilities. One of the VCS organisations, members of staff, is now leading a piece of work, task-finished piece of work in relation to that in terms of profiling that work. Whilst there isn't a lot of resources to undertake a great deal of work in relation to that in terms of knowledge and skills in relation to the sector, there are a number of briefings which are planned. So hopefully that will, that translates that national agenda which the VCS can bring in terms of knowledge base and knowledge into a much more local perspective, and will enable staff to be better skilled in terms of understanding those key issues.
Can I just tease that out for a second here? I mean, because my understanding is, and I suspect people listening would think, you've got a range of voluntary organisations, many of whom would touch on in one form or another the issues to do with child sexual exploitation that you mentioned, and they would be scattered throughout the community doing different things. Now, I'm suspecting some of them are to do with awareness raising, some of them to do with information sharing, some direct work with young people, and others possibly in some form of social media or whatever in terms of awareness, as I said. But also some would be dealing possibly with survivors and victims of exploitation, and others would be out there, if you like, pointing out how to recognise people at risk. So is that a fair idea of the range of work going on in Bradford? Because, I mean, the voluntary sector is huge.
It is, it's massive. And as you said, I think you're right. There'll be some people that are doing direct work in relation to that. And I can think of, the hub, in terms of the hub that exists. There are voluntary and community sector organisations involved in that work, doing preventative roles. For example, the nighttime economy staff is a voluntary and community sector member of staff that really has made a significant impact in terms of awareness raising right across a number of agencies.
This is like fast food outlets at midnight, taxi drivers and so forth, the way that we have all the agencies and as I said, with the voluntary sector component to it as well, have actually been in there to educate and influence and if you like, raise the awareness of all the people that work in these industries about helping prevent young people get sucked into grooming, get taken over by gangs, and get, just totally fooled into virtually losing their childhood. That's what you're talking about, isn't it?
It is, and it's the impact of that, and where a member of staff, for example, in a taxi firm, in a taxi rank, in working in isolation late at night, has never been exposed to potentially what they might be able to do. It's not that they don't want to do anything and they don't recognise risks necessarily, but it's about enabling people who work in reasonably isolated positions about thinking, what can I do? That doesn't seem right. Who should I contact? And how can I share intelligence about what's going on in relation to the lives of young people, vulnerable young people?
Okay, well, why don't we stick with the young people for a sec? Because I know another one of your particular passions, and if you like, a rolling initiative, is the participation of young people in not only in designing kind of work and designing initiatives, but also being able to be there to put their opinion, if you like, into the hat. The Safeguarding Board at the moment is looking to improve the voice of the child, the voice of the young person. And I'm certain you're going to be one of the people that we're going to be talking to about how to construct something better now. What kind of thoughts and ideas would you have about that?
I think in relation to the way that, the first principle we need to look at that without the voice, including the voice of children, young people, their parents and carers, and a wide range of community voices, then I don't think we can have an effective framework in relation to safeguarding. I think we've made a number of strides in relation to that as a board over the years. I think we've got further to go. I think more recently, in terms of the work that the local authority and partners have done in terms of engaging with young people and putting a framework around that, has made significant improvements in terms of trying to get a whole range of young people's voices included in certain forum. There's good examples of that. And I might, if you can use the recent example of Takeover Day, which I think is an excellent example of a commitment across the district, across partnerships, to include and promote the voice and involvement of young people within services.
Say a bit about it, because this has already happened.
Yeah, it's happened, and it happened on November the 18th, or was it? Yes, it was the 18th. And it's an initiative, it's a national initiative by the Children's Commissioner, led by the Children's Commission. And it's something that, as a district, we've looked at before and been reasonably successful with in pockets, I believe, in terms of reasonable isolation. This year, I think there's been a number of strides in terms of improvements about how that's been rolled out. There's a number of schools which have been involved, which is absolutely excellent. There's been local authorities, there's been health have been heavily involved in that, which is a really exciting development, because health are really interested in getting involved, young people involved in that process.
Say a little bit about what it involves, would you?
Well, it involves young people effectively being matched with professionals. So a young person, so it's again a pool of young people, it's again a pool of professionals, joining them together in a role for the day. That included myself, so I had a young person who we went to a range of meetings and did a number of things. On a far more exciting level, young people have been involved in, for example, working with staff on a maternity ward. There was a really excellent example of the local authority social work team, whilst considering the duty of care towards confidentiality and everything else which exists within that environment. But they did some role play with young people, which was fantastic, and they got a real sense of what a social worker and social work department might do, what their views in relation to that, and how they might feed into that process. It was an eye-opener, I think, for both sets of people. Whether at the most senior levels or, at a middle managers or a face-to-face worker, in terms of the influencing role of young people. And I think it's that legacy that we can use in terms of thinking, how do we get and how do we involve young people in the working of the board, or in terms of their role in terms of influencing that.
That was very successful, and it's something that's been repeated. Initiative, awareness raising, both sides get to understand a little bit more and so on. But you'll be aware that all over the country there are so many different types of initiatives to include young people in. That we've had youth parliaments, we've had shadow boards, we've had individual young people coming and sitting on the board. Here we're more favouring possibly a young person's forum that can advise the board and kind of digest issues and then go back to the board with their ideas about them. But I mean, are there other models that you've come across? Because I think we all want to be particularly contemporary and make it useful and interesting for the young people, rather than just a sort of a mirror of kind of adult meetings.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the risks in relation to that. And that young, from my experience and the experience of the work and organisations that work with young people, I think that would mirror what young people would say. That the fact that if they're just expected to go along to meetings, not necessarily involved in a way that's meaningful, then they're unlikely to take part and want to take part in future. I think in terms of that, I think in relation to what you're saying before about sort of mirroring some of the work or involving young people in task finish. I think task finish groups in particular are really helpful in relation to focusing and getting a broad church of young people, because that's going to involve a number of people, in terms of different aspects that are meaningful for them. Online bullying is a big issue. We know that in terms of what young people are telling us. How do we capture the rich source of data that young people have got in terms of not only what they experience, but what some of the solutions might be in terms of that. I can think of, and we've used that experience recently in terms of work with the CCG.
That's the community, the commissioning group from the health service.
That's the commissioning groups within the health service in terms of developing online resources which young people can access. The Thrive Bradford website is a resource which has been developed by young people using social media, which has a number of resources which young people can access, including advice about bullying, but in relation to emotional mental health. And that's provided a really effective platform for young people's voice to actually be integrated into service design. And I think that's where the exciting steps are in relation to that. You said we did, I think is an exciting principle, and I think it's something that should guide the board in terms of
You said we
the future direction. Yeah, so young people are saying, look, this is what we're saying, and I know we've done online bullying, and then the board has reacted positively in relation to that in terms of bullying. I know that because there's been conferences, and we're following up work with that. It's a high priority in terms of young people's emotional mental health. I think it should be seen as a high priority.
Well, I mean, let me talk to you a little bit about what today's bringing, if you like, the issues of the day, if you like. I mean, partly, obviously, just as a sort of final point on what you were saying there, the board is improving its website and therefore its online presence, and I definitely want to have a strong youth component to that. But in terms of the voluntary and community sector, so many sports clubs and recreational outlets for young people are now once again under the spotlight. Have you picked up a sense of how the community is feeling about this, or what possible things could happen to kind of inform people better and actually get a sense in Bradford about what's happening?
I think that's a really interesting point, because clearly it is a really high profile issue at the moment in terms of local media reporting, national media reporting. In terms of a sense locally, I don't pick up a sense that there's a specific issues in relation to local sports facilities, other than we know that there's a growing awareness for the need to have we know there's a need for robust framework to be in place in relation to the protection of children and young people that access service and safeguard their needs. We know that in terms of our role within Young Lives Bradford, I think that's a next step in terms of the self-challenge in relation to that, in terms of saying we've got a broad church of a number of organisations that we know that there are robust safeguarding framework arrangements in place across a whole range of organisations. We know that because they report that as part of the commission arrangements, including the Section 11 requirements in terms of self-auditing and reporting back as part of the commission arrangements.
Section 11 of the Children Act, in terms of it, every agency has to report back every year about what they've been doing and what the priorities are and issues and so forth. Just now, for those of you who are not in the UK.
Yeah, sorry about that. However, in terms of how then do we move that forward in terms of engaging a broader range of organisations in terms of that auditing process, I think it's going to be an interesting process, and one that we need to look at and to engage a wider range of organisations within that.
Okay, well, how many Young Lives Bradford, right? You said there's a very large number of affiliated groups to that. I mean, are there many? I mean, I know you might not know exact numbers, but sports and recreational clubs in there.
But a number will, the governing bodies of sport will, have their own affiliations and their own memberships in terms of that. There are a number of sports organisations, but I mean, it's difficult to say the total number out of the 300 at the moment. I can't give you a precise figure. However, I think in terms of that broad approach to saying, look, we know, because we understand, don't we, in terms of safeguarding, I think there's, the growing realisation for the need within action right across partnerships in terms of wherever young people congregate, then there will unfortunately be a small number of adults who will wish to harm children, and that's something we need to look at in terms of how do we ensure the most robust framework we can put in place in terms of that. And it's about education, support, and also partnerships in terms of that, and about, and the board plays a full role in relation to that in terms of engaging in that process. And I see that's why Young Lives Bradford, in terms of the work of the board and the work in terms of safeguarding, plays such a pivotal role in relation to that.
Okay, let me ask you this then, because would it be useful, do you think, if the board put on some kind of an event for all these sports kind of the associations, if you like, to come together, and other key people to just reflect as much as anything on what's available in terms of help, in terms of support, what key messages we need to reinforce, because obviously some will have done some recent work, others will have been many years since they did any child protection training. And one thing that's always struck me is to remind people that there's two sides to child protection. And I mean, for example, yes, there's the making sure that the adults working with young people are as safe as we can tell. But on the other side, all these adults, and many of them in sports clubs and so forth, are heroes to the young people. And they're more than likely to be people that young people might choose to disclose to. And how they deal with that, how they're prepared for that, how they're trained, if you like, to be able to deal with that young person's disclosure as professionally as possible, to me, always gets lost a bit, because the idea of just making sure that they're safe people seems to dominate. Would you agree that that's something?
No, I agree with that sentiment, and I agree strongly with that. And I think that's where there needs to be the further towards the front end in terms of service delivery. Those people who are actually involved and engaged with young people, and significant numbers of young people on a day-to-day basis, on an evening, at night, volunteers working with young people, where young people build relationships. You're quite right, and they build relationships and they will disclose information. And it's almost that it's those workers and those staff and volunteers that need to be almost the best equipped within the sector, across a whole range of workforce. I'm not saying they exclusively need to have specialist training, but they need to be upskilled in terms of and supported in the way that they have their own knowledge about what they do with the information, how comfortable they're sharing information, and about having the confidence to work within their organisation, have their voices heard. I think strongly in terms of organisations where to have safe organisations, we need transparent organisations, and we need to have a light shined in relation to all the corners of clubs where we work. So there's no ambiguity in terms of the work we're doing. We're not putting barriers in place. We're not putting extra work. We're not stopping the good work that people do. We're trying to support people, and we're trying to enable the good work that takes place. And I think in terms of that, I think there's a good case for further work in terms of raising the profile, engaging the board with those frontline organisations, whether it be sport organisations or heritage and culture or uniform, any work that takes place across the VCS, I think is helpful from the board. It builds on previous work that we've done a number of years ago, just after the transition from PC, Area Child Protection Committee, to local Safeguarding Children Board, under the Children Act, and in terms of awareness raising, that was reasonably successful in terms of putting the message out, saying we're listening to you, we want to engage with you. It's raising the profile of the board, and I think there's a real need to increase the level of awareness of the board and its workings right across the board, from young people to organisations themselves.
Okay, Dave. Well, we're coming to the end of the interview, but I'd just like to ask you as a sort of final question, and use it as a platform, whatever. Imagine that there are, and there probably are, one or two people listening who would be considering volunteering, would be considering kind of, if you like, joining your world. What advice would you give them, and what would you say are the rewards that can be expected? I know it's long, hard work sometimes, and I know there are all sorts of other kind of challenges. However, it is rewarding, and I wonder if you'd say a little bit about it just briefly.
It is rewarding. There are a number of roles people can get into. It can be a platform for some people. It can be a life-changing event in terms of career progression. About young people volunteer. They find out in terms of their sense of themselves, where they want to go potentially in the future. Adults become involved, or adults can become involved in a whole range of volunteering opportunities with children and young people, which are immensely rewarding. Some of it's attached to their own interests in terms of their own sport or wherever, and they want to give something back. It provides an ideal opportunity, but it can be a transformative opportunity for the volunteer themselves, but particularly children and young people who are supported by adults who provide appropriate role models, who can enable and support, who can guide, and who can better protect them as well for the future, but both now and for the future.
let me just ask you to reassure people quickly. I did a radio interview this morning with BBC in London, and because there seems to be a real problem in London about the length of time that DBS checks are taking to come through, and some people are even losing the opportunities of employment because of the Met Police, particularly. I mean, they say they would have it done within 2 months tops, but that's taking much longer in many cases, and there's quite a backlog. Is it a different experience in Bradford? I'm pretty sure it is, but I just want you to say so and reassure people that they're not going to be having to wait a long time.
No, my experience is that isn't. It's interesting you've said that. Our experience in relation to turning DBS around has been a lot quicker in relation to that.
Sorry, that's the disclosure and barring service. That was my fault. Where the police checks are done on people before they're allowed to work with children or vulnerable adults.
And you know that forms one part of a process of recruitment and retention of staff in terms of an interview, but also it needn't be a cumbersome and long process, and that's not necessarily our experience of that in terms of locally. It's interesting to hear what happening in other parts of the country, but that shouldn't put volunteers off. It should, if you're volunteering, you should feel reassured that by the fact that you're being recruited, inducted and trained as part of a process, that you'll have the skills and you can bring your own skills in relation to supporting young people appropriately.
Dave, Benn, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.